join us. This is a webinar sponsored by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of Institute for Operations Research and Management Sciences, Informs. This webinar is intended to discuss the impact on our research posed by laws that restrict engagement with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and related concepts at institutions of higher education in the US. I'm Michael Johnson. I am the chair of the Research Pathways Subcommittee of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. The DEIC has been around since, I think, 2015. Let's see, Chris, our current president, is named, what is her name? The DEIC. Anahita Kojandi, who is a charter member, along with me, of the DEIC and a proud sponsor of this event. Let me briefly introduce the panelists and then say a few more words about this event. Our first panelist is Justin Utilier, the Charles Ringrose Assistant Professor in Industrial and Systems Engineering and a faculty affiliate in emergency medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his research focuses on combining optimization and machine learning to improve the quality, access, and delivery of healthcare in a variety of settings. And before coming to Wisconsin, he was a postdoctoral associate with the Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab in the Center for Transportation and Logistics at MIT. Our second panelist is Julie Ivey. Julie Simmons-Ivey is a professor in the Edward P. Fitz Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering and Fitz Faculty Fellow in Health Systems Engineering at North Carolina State University. She is previous chair of the Health Applications Society and past president of the Informs Minority Issues Forum, and her research interests are mathematical modeling of stochastic dynamic systems with an emphasis on statistics and decision analysis as applied to healthcare, public health, and humanitarian logistics. Our third panelist is Adrienne Lu. Adrienne is a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where she writes about politics in higher education and students with a focus on underrepresented students. This year, she's led the Chronicle's reporting on legislation to restrict diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in higher education this year, including a website to track legislation across the country targeting DEI. Maybe, Adrienne, I could ask if you could put the DEI legislation tracker in the chat for all of us. Okay. Another member of our team is Gina Lloyd, who is the Chief Human Resource Officer for Informs. She's the primary contact to the Informs office for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and she'll act as moderator for today's event. Hi, Gina. And so I've learned that this is a regular Zoom meeting. It is not a webinar, so all of us can see each other. All of us can contribute questions in the chat. And since we're intimate audience this morning, we can be informal. And so after the panelist presentations, participants are welcome to raise their hand or put a question in the chat, and I'll recognize them. So what I'm hoping we'll do is have Chris Vogatsis, a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, give an overview of Informs DEI activities and the DEI committee. Then we'll move to the panelist statements. We'll start with Adrienne, who will give an overview of politics and higher education as it relates to DEI. Then we'll have Justin give his perspective on all of these issues with reference to his own experiences. And then we'll ask the same of Julie Ivy. After that, we'll have panel discussion where I'll moderate and pose various questions, then an open Q&A, and then final remarks from the panelists. Are these ground rules okay for everyone? Great. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks everyone for participating in today's webinar. I'm thoroughly excited for the outcomes and the conversation that we're going to have. So I want to briefly introduce some of the activities and some of the efforts that the DEIC, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the Institute for the Operations Research and the Management Sciences. So Informs has a direct link to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their strategic plan. And I quote from the strategic plan, advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in all we do. And the work that Informs has been doing over the years as far as DEI has been largely decentralized, which is a great thing. We heard earlier from prior president, from Julie Ivy from the Minority Issues Forum, which has been instrumental in bringing up some of the issues within Informs. The DEIC, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, is a means to connect all of these different activities and bring together different communities and people within Informs. Other people that are doing work related to DEI are within subdivision groups, for example, communications from the health applied, the health analytics or junior faculty interest group. We have the women in operations research and the management sciences, and again, so many other areas. As I said earlier, the Informs values diversity, equity, and inclusion actively, and that's the reason why within the DEIC we have had the possibility to grow into encompassing multiple different subcommittees. Michael mentioned earlier about his work within the research pathways, which one of the outputs, one of the products is the webinar that we have here, along with many other webinars. There is even a research competition for undergraduate paper awards for work within DEI that has spawned out of the research pathways, among many other things. But we also have teaching pathways, which focuses on how do we do inclusive pedagogy within the operations research and the management sciences, community building, practice, which is something pretty new that Informs has recognized that we do not focus that much on practitioner issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is something that we are trying to work towards fixing. And last but not least, I want to briefly mention about the Ambassador Program. So the Ambassador Program tries to bring in together Informs members, and they work on a novel initiative which tries to improve the experience that members have within the Informs community. So this started in 2020 with, I believe, 7 projects or 8 projects. I'll put a link in the chat that we can share with everyone who's interested. And there are calls that are going out every fall. So the latest call will go out in fall 2023. And all of these ambassador programs help towards, creating one more step towards a truly equitable experience for all of our members within Informs. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I'll just put the link with all of this information, our ambassador programs, as well as an activity that I think is very useful for our members, one on an unconscious and unconscious bias video training that Informs helped produce. I hope that you find this useful. If you have more information, if you have more questions, or if you want to share anything else, please feel free to reach out to Anahita, that I'm glad to be filling in for, or myself, or Michael. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope that was a brief but concise introduction to what the DEIC tries to do.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks very much. I realized that I didn't properly introduce myself to all of you. So I'm Michael Johnson. I'm a professor in the Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs, at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a longtime Informs member, proud graduate of the Operations Research Doctoral Program at Northwestern. As I said, chair of the Research Pathways Subcommittee. And someone who has a long interest in this. Chris, I want to acknowledge, and Gina, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and Informs for their steadfast support for this activity and many others. As a long-term member, I can say that Informs really wants to make our organization a welcoming and supportive place for all. So thank you very much for helping make this event possible. I'd like now, if I could, to turn it over to Adrienne. I think you have a perspective on many of these proposals, these bills, some that have turned into signed laws across the country that may be things that us in the academy may not have time to be as familiar with as we should. And we welcome whatever you can share with us about your experience with these laws.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. Since the start of the year, the Chronicle has been tracking, as you said, state legislation to restrict DEI efforts in higher ed. We started this tracker because after the Manhattan and Goldwater Institutes released model state legislation in January to restrict DEI in higher ed, and they were focused on 4 specific areas. And these were also the areas that we decided to track. One was prohibiting DEI offices or staff, prohibiting mandatory DEI training, prohibiting the use of diversity statements in hiring or admissions, and then prohibiting colleges from using characteristics such as race, ethnicity, gender, again, in admissions and hiring. So one question is why this surge in anti-DEI legislation? Why is this happening now? And of course, in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there's been increased awareness and desire in higher ed, as in other sectors, to focus on DEI. However, in state legislatures, lawmakers have been targeting critical race theory, for example, for some time now, in terms of using race as a factor in admissions. Even before the Supreme Court decision recently, there were 9 states that were already prohibiting race-conscious admissions. One thing that really got our attention in December, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis gave a speech where he said, "Florida is where woke goes to die," and shortly after demanded that the public colleges and universities in Florida present an accounting of how much they were spending on DEI programs. And we saw several states sort of follow suit after that: Oklahoma, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Texas. So we were just curious to see what would come of all of that. So I just wanted to briefly go over, and hopefully this isn't too repetitive for all of you, some of the arguments for and against DEI work in higher education. The opponents, most of them Republican, say that the DEI bureaucracy has gone too far, that it's expensive, it's ineffective. They argue that it infringes on academic freedom, that it goes against the American ideal of treating people as individuals. And some argue that DEI work is a way for colleges to try to indoctrinate students in woke ideology. And on the other side, the supporters of DEI programs say that they are needed to help maintain diversity on college campuses for the benefit of all students, and particularly to help underrepresented students who graduate at lower rates than other students. And the supporters also argue that DEI activities are intended to help not just students of color, but many other students who have not always felt welcome on college campuses. These can include first-generation college students, students with disabilities, students from low-income households, veterans, and on and on. So we were curious to see how much traction the state model legislation would get. So we started tracking them earlier this year. And again, when we started, we really had no idea where this would take us, what would happen in the states. And so here we are in July. Key findings to date, and many of the state legislative sessions have ended for the year, a few have not. But so far, we have found 40 bills covering targeting those 4 specific areas of DEI that I mentioned in 22 states. So across the country, there's been quite a bit of interest. Of those, 7 have become laws in 5 different states. Those are Florida, North Carolina, North Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. So far, 29 of those bills have died somewhere along the way in at least the current legislative session. They could come back, in future sessions. And most of the bills that have passed are fairly narrow in scope. Florida and Texas are exceptions. They have bills that are pretty wide-ranging, and I'll get into a little bit of that later on. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I'll talk about a little bit of that now. So Florida passed one bill that forbids public colleges from spending federal or state funds on programs or activities that advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are exceptions to comply with federal laws and for accreditation with approval from the state. And there are also exceptions for programs for veterans, Pell Grant recipients, first-generation college students, non-traditional students, certain transfer students from the state college system, students from low-income families, and students with unique abilities. Texas similarly has a pretty broad-ranging bill. Theirs was a part of the budget bill, and that legislation bans diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and staff, bans the use of diversity statements, mandatory diversity training, and giving preference to candidates based on characteristics including race and sex. Again, there are exceptions for federal law and accreditation. The Texas law also specifically exempts classroom instruction, research, or creative work. Most of this takes effect January 1st, but the prohibition on state funding of DEI activities actually begins September 1st. So I think I'm going to leave it there for now. I'm curious to hear your questions. I dropped a link to our DEI tracker, and if you are not a subscriber, if your institution is not a subscriber to the Chronicle, you can register with your email address, and I think that will give you access to a few articles, free articles a month. So I encourage you all to do that. I'm also going to drop a second link, which is a link to our package of stories about anti-DEI legislation. So thanks, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Adrienne, thank you very much for your information, and thanks for the links that you've put in the chat. I'd like now to turn it to Justin. If you could tell us about your experience in this space, where you are currently, and maybe your perspectives from places outside of your state.
Sure. So thank you for having me here today. So my name is Justin. I'm going to speak about a few different things. I think the first thing is sort of going to be focused more on the benefits of diversity and equity and inclusion, broadly speaking, and sort of how that might intersect with us as operations researchers and management science. So the first thing I want to make, and this was something I recently did a workshop here at UW, and they did a great job of summarizing all the benefits associated with diversity and inclusion. And I think one of the really important things to realize is there's a lot of evidence that suggests that diverse research teams do better, and do better can be quantified in different ways. There's papers that quantify this in producing more successful patents, publishing in higher impact journals, developing more creative or sort of innovative ideas. There's sort of a wide range of literature in this space that provides some evidence and some sort of research to suggest and to show the benefits of diversity. And so I think to start off, I think that's an important perspective to have, just to realize that diverse teams seem to be better. And so as an academic, as someone who wants to be successful in in our field, I think that's something we should look towards and be aware of, that, you know, simply increasing diversity can actually help us become more productive, more impactful, access to new ideas and broader perspectives. So I think that's an important thing right away. The second sort of piece that goes with that, and I think this was related, we had a brief discussion amongst the panelists before we started, is that these initiatives, so a lot of inclusion and diversity work, helps with retention and recruitment, right? And so, and I think that's particularly the case here in the US, where a lot of these laws are happening on a state-by-state basis. And so this could create situations where we have certain states and universities at competitive advantages or disadvantages compared to others, right? And so you could imagine folks who are from underrepresented groups or who want to participate in more inclusive environments are likely going to tend to those places that have inclusive environments and efforts around them. And so I think from my own perspective, this is something I've witnessed. UW is a tricky state where we have a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor, so we have a wide range of political views. But we do currently still have some programs that allow us to recruit and retain both students and faculty with diversity, equity, inclusion in mind. And I myself have had success recruiting students using these programs, using these tools. And so I think it's, that's another, I think, important aspect of this conversation, is just, again, the fact that these can be used to help us become more productive, more, better at what we do. And the other piece I'll mention here is, on the other side of the coin, I think OR and management science is, as a field, uniquely positioned to actually use our research to address issues with diversity, inclusion, and equity, right? A lot of our work, especially towards management science, can include things around fairness, can include issues around equity and outcomes. So whether you're studying healthcare or, classic sort of like OM business topics, I think our work can actually be used to improve these types of dimensions. And so I think that's another important aspect for us as Informs to sort of realize is that, we both want to support these initiatives, but we can also use our research to actually further and contribute to some of this work, which I think is really exciting. Again, me personally, I do a lot of work in global health. So I'm working in countries all over the world, and primarily with underrepresented groups, particularly in healthcare. And so, I think that's an important way to leverage our skills to kind of contribute to these missions all over the world. I think the one thing I have learned through doing some of this is that DEI efforts look different all over the world. And I think that's something for me that has been particularly interesting to observe. It's different in every state, and just in this country, you can imagine as you start to branch outside of the US, the differences you see. For example, I'm a Canadian, things are slightly different there. I work in India, even more different over there in terms of these aspects. So I think another thing, knowing the diverse audience and membership of Informs, we should sort of be aware of the differences across the world that come with DEI efforts, and how these things might change in different countries, and what we can do as a society as well as researchers to kind of influence some of this stuff. I think that would be great as well. And then the last thing I'll say, I guess, is a quick mention from Wisconsin. There's been lots of news articles and legislation going on here in the state, both to restrict DEI offices and positions at the university system. I believe the governor vetoed some of these, some of this legislature. Some of it was not vetoed, but this has been, if you Google around, you'll see quite a few articles bringing up this back and forth discussion that's gone on here. So it's sort of unclear how this will all settle down, but it's, I think could be hurtful for us in the long term if some of these programs restrict our ability to be competitive in retaining and recruiting faculty and creating an inclusive space that leads to, better research. So I think that's all I'll say for now. I'm happy to answer questions as things come up and give my perspective on things. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you. I'd like now to invite Julie Ivy to share her perspectives on all of these topics. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me and including me in this session. I think this is really important for us to talk about. I want to second and echo some of what Justin has said, particularly around the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of our field and our research. My research is very human-centric. I work on problems in healthcare. I work on problems in humanitarian logistics, specifically around hunger relief, and I work on problems in education. For each of these problems, part of where my research centers is really thinking about what does equity mean in these spaces? How can we develop models and tools and methods so that we can identify where there are disparities and then think about ways that we can reduce them or mitigate them. If we think about informs, at one time we had the motto, the science is better, right? Thinking about how do we make systems work better, operate better, and thinking about specifically equity, inclusion, and diversity is critical for systems to not be myopic and optimizing for a subset of either a population or a space, but thinking globally. And for us, I think that there are some rich opportunities for us in terms of methodologically, what we can develop when we think about, when we think about equity, the fundamental idea of equity is that everyone doesn't need the same thing. And that then challenges us to think about what does a global optimal solution look like? What are good solutions? How do we develop methods where we kind of personalize to the needs of individuals in multiple spaces? And how do we consider the way that we use things like data to inform that decision making? If we think about the world that we live in right now, where there's a rise of AI and other ways that we learn from data. When we learn from data, we learn from decisions and actions that we have taken that are endogenous to that data and embedded in this data. And those can be decisions that were good, and those can be decisions that were not good, right? They're just actions that people took. So then when we learn from that data, then we need to think about, what are the consequences of that? And us as modelers, data analysts, optimizers, that means it's really important for us when we think about what is a good decision or an optimal decision. How has it been influenced by underlying endogenous decisions that are embedded? And so that's critical then for us to be able to look and see what impact does this optimal solution have on different populations, different groups, different individuals. In what ways is it maybe adversely and unintended consequences that occur? We see numerous examples in our society where we have, I'll say, machine learning models gone wrong that have had significant impacts in embedding discrimination into or codifying it into systems. So we have systems related to the selection of bank loans, right? And we've had papers where we've seen that those systems embedded endogenous biased decisions, right, from the data, and then learned to discriminate, and in fact replicated that over time. We have examples in healthcare where, because we didn't take or consider a diverse population, we have things like O2 sensors that don't read well or on darker skin. And so then the consequence is that when we're testing the O2 levels of patients who have COVID, who have darker skin, it tends to read higher. And so we're less likely to intervene. And as a result of being less likely to intervene, we might have poorer outcomes. So all of these things indicate, like in particular for our field, how important it is for us to think about diversity. So that means diversifying our research teams, diversifying the way we look at our models and subjects, in the way that we model environments and communities in ways that are diverse, inclusive, and then thinking about how do we consider equity and how do we measure it and what are the consequences of the objective functions we use, or the fact that every single problem we solve is a multi-criteria problem. How are we capturing those different criteria in our models? How are we making sure that our models actually give good solutions? And then how are we defining what good is? So for us, I don't think this is an optional topic for us to consider, because we in fact build systems and models that inform decision-making globally in so many industries, and they're underlying. I think every time I go somewhere, like say, for example, I go to a doctor's office and I notice that I make it from the exam room from the lobby into the exam room super quickly. I realize that somebody's using a model that measures waiting time from the time it took to get to the exam room, but nobody considered how long you wait for the doctor to appear, right? So that objective function resulted in the systems that I use and, in the experience that I have. I think that as industrial engineers, as operations researchers, as management scientists, as policy makers that are people that inform policy, we have an imperative that we think about diversity, both in inclusion of the research teams that we create and develop, the way that we model the world that we're trying to characterize or optimize, as well as in the way that we even, consider our own research. And so it's almost amazing that words such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, it could in any way have a negative connotation when in fact they're so critical to the world in which we live. And so I will stop here and be happy to talk about this more during the question section.
Julie, thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. I really appreciate it. I'd like now to ask some questions of all the panelists, and panelists are welcome to ask questions of each other as well before we open it up to the audience. I'd like to start by asking Adrienne if she can verify my perception that many of these anti-DEI laws seem to focus their greatest impact on administrators, in a sense, having carve-outs for teachers and professors and researchers. Is that the case, Adrienne?
I would say that's true of the Texas law. The Florida law does have some things to say about teaching. And I'm trying to look up my notes so I can get it exactly right. It says that general education courses may not distort significant historical events or include a curriculum that teaches identity politics or is based on theories that systemic racism, sexism, oppression, and privilege are inherent in the institutions of the United States and were created to maintain social, political, and economic inequities. So it varies. But yeah, you're right that the Texas law specifically exempts teaching and research.
Thank you. So I'd like now to follow up with Julie and Justin. What have you seen regarding the impacts of anti-DEI laws on the daily practice of people like you, professors?
I can start, I suppose, or give a small response. I guess for me personally, I haven't felt a lot of this yet. I mean, so, certainly Wisconsin doesn't have quite the same scope of legislation as Texas or Florida. At least I don't think it's at that same level. So like me personally, I haven't felt this so much yet. I suspect that I will a little bit in the coming years. I have, a student who is recruited on a program that specifically goes after underrepresented students from certain backgrounds and encourages them to get into engineering, which I think is an important initiative. So I am curious to know if funding for that program will exist in the future or not, and that would certainly have an effect potentially on my research program and my students. But that's, I would say, sort of from a very practical standpoint, the sort of closest I've felt some of this so far.
Thanks, Justin. Julie, any perspectives you might wish to share on the personal impacts of these laws?
For me, I find this to be very personal. I feel specifically like my history is being suppressed. I feel like my freedom of speech is being suppressed. I feel like the ability of my children to learn their history is being suppressed. And so it is very personal to me. I think that First Amendment rights of free speech are actually being suppressed significantly, personally. And in terms of research, I think that the way that I approach my research is the same, because I do think about questions of equity. I'm very interested in disparities and the way that we can use modeling to both identify those, but then think about ways to mitigate that and improve equity and what it might look like from different lenses. I think that in the state that I live, different places I've been, there have been more rules. I've been in more meetings where people are talking about changing language or thinking very carefully about what they're able to ask in different settings, what a title might imply or infer. I've seen people being concerned about using the word DEI in many settings, and whether that's going to be allowed, acceptable. And so I am seeing impacts that are happening. Just even over the course of the summer, I've seen an evolution that's been pretty strong since I'd say the beginning of the summer to the end, in different committees and organizations on campus, and also other national ones where this conversation around what language are we allowed to use, what are we allowed to do, and it does seem to be it is impacting people's free speech in this context. And so I think also we need to be careful when not careful, but like we say DEI, but we forget it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like that's what the words mean. It's not just an acronym that doesn't have meaning. And if we look at the definitions of each of these words, it's hard to understand what could be wrong with them. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Julie.
Can I ask a question for you, Michael? I'm just curious about something, not to like put you on the spot, but I think Julie and I are both in, states where this seems to be a more prominent issue, where you're in Massachusetts, which from my outside perspective, this doesn't seem to be quite as big of a political issue in the state of Massachusetts. And I might be totally wrong, so please feel free to correct me. But are you feeling things there similar to sort of what we have both mentioned that we're feeling in our places? Like I'm just curious on the differences across states.
Sorry
to put you on the spot.
I haven't felt the same kinds of pressures that my colleagues in other states have faced regarding perceived or actual restrictions on what we can say or what kinds of research we can do or what kinds of community engagement we can perform. And for that, I'm very grateful. I teach at an urban minority or communities of color dominant serving university with an explicit mission towards local impact, social justice, and racial equity and anti-racism. And I'm very grateful to be in an environment that acknowledges structural barriers to opportunity, historical inequities, and takes a critical approach to public policy problems in our time. And so for me, I feel, as Julie does, that these anti-DEI laws really strike at the core of what is really important to me as a scholar. And I'm fortunate that in this state, we seem to be taking notions of anti-racism and social justice quite seriously. So thank you, Justin, for asking me that. I'd like to ask a question for Justin and Julie especially. So one trope that we see often in public discourse about DEI is this notion that professors are indoctrinating our students regarding an ideology. I won't say any more, but I think I'd like to ask both of you, from your perspectives as engineering professors, what do you make of this notion that professors have a platform or an opportunity to indoctrinate students?
I don't really think we get to indoctrinate students. Like I get to teach them stochastic modeling. I get to teach them about Markov chains. I get to teach them about things like that and like what's known and what's existed. I don't really get to ask them about their personal views, really. And usually the classroom tends to be quite open for people to share, ask questions. Like we want people to contribute their thoughts and their feelings. I mean, I think that there are some things, and it may be because we're in engineering, can be a little bit different because we tend to teach math courses, but I mean, I also teach courses in health systems engineering. So we look at healthcare and healthcare delivery, and we think about ways that we could use different industrial engineering tools like simulation or mathematical modeling, the DMAIC, as ways to model systems, look at how they're connected and interact. But I don't think we necessarily get to indoctrinate them in our personal views, because we're actually supposed to be training them in terms of a particular field and what the current state of knowledge is in that field. And actually, I think one of the beauty things about engineering, particularly industrial engineering and optimization, systems modeling, is that we want people to be systems thinkers. We want them to think about connections. We're asking them in all ways to think about how can we do better? What, is the wait time too long here? Is there, there's this mindset that I think students come in with in the way that they critique the world and try to think of making it better. And so, I don't know, the more open we can be to hearing those voices from students, we actually might make better systems. And so.
Thanks, Julie. Justin, do you have anything that you'd like to share from your experience in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I think I agree with what Julie's saying. I mean, we're in a unique position in that we're not often, we're not often able to really share personal views in the classroom. We're teaching more methods in a lot of the things that we do. I mean, I do teach a course on machine learning and a course on health systems engineering, and certainly discussions of bias come up. I mean, as Julie mentioned earlier, using crappy data is going to build crappy models, right? And so I think these topics certainly do come up around how to find bias in data and what biases could exist in data, and how we might be able to use our technical methods to mitigate some of those issues to build, better systems going forward. And that, I think, also, as Julie mentioned, comes up in healthcare, where we're analyzing in some of my healthcare class, we look at healthcare outcomes, right, across broad groups of people and try to understand why does this work for, this particular group, but not for that group, and how can we improve it and make it better so it works well for everyone, which I think is that's a great goal, right? No one, I don't think anyone will would disagree that that's the objective here. So those things come up, but I don't think I wouldn't call it indoctrinating. A lot of this is very sort of methods focused and data driven and kind of, I think of this, yeah.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, and so I asked the question because I was inspired by Adrienne's remarks early on about the rationales for these anti-DEI laws. And so, Adrienne, I wanted to give you the chance to respond to the question I asked about indoctrination, but also earlier, if you have any experiences as a journalist that you can share about the effect of these laws on the daily experiences of professors that you have met.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add on to what I said earlier in terms of your question about how professors might be impacted. And one way that that folks have been telling us will potentially have a big impact is on research grants, where if funders are asking for evidence of research impacting DEI, and if your state has said you can't do DEI, it's going to be probably very difficult to win grants. So that is one way that professors could potentially be very directly impacted if this is what funders are looking for. So
thanks. And Adrienne, I'm wondering if in your work you have come across any firsthand accounts of professors or instructors who feel they have been directly affected by these laws or the prospect of these laws.
Sure. Yeah, I've talked to professors, and a couple of my colleagues did a really interesting story looking at how professors are already changing, even before these laws were passed, we're already changing what they were teaching based on a fear of not wanting to draw attention to themselves or to their institutions. And again, this was even before the laws were passed. So there has, definitely been a chilling effect where professors are steering away from teaching certain concepts or authors just out of a fear of not wanting to raise any heckles. So,
thank you. I'd like, if I could, we have some audience participants. I'd like to open it up now if any of the audience have questions for any of the panelists.
Hi, Michael. I'll ask a question if you don't mind.
Yes, please, David.
Hi, everyone. Great conversation, great discussion. Thank you. Thanks for organizing this. Chris mentioned that one of the strategic goals for Informs involves DEI in everything that we do. And so I'm just curious, with the things within our control, are there more things Informs could be doing? And I know that Informs has been doing a much better job of making sure that we're putting DEI into our policies and procedures. And I know the board has been very active in looking at committee compositions, awards, things like that. But I also think externally, trying to recruit more minority members into our field. And then Michael and I founded Pro Bono Analytics. So one of the things that I push on is making sure that the solutions we develop are available to everyone. Not just people that can afford to hire one of us full time. So I'm just curious, are there more things that you think that as a community that we could be doing or doing through Informs?
If you don't mind, I'll just start with that over here. Definitely. I remember that when I first met Michael, and I'm sorry again to be putting you on the spot, you had said that, we will be successful when we do not need a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee anymore within Informs, right? But this is something that clearly it's like one step at a time. Like we've recognized Informs. I'm very happy with the efforts that we have been taking because we are recognizing some of our blind spots. Some may call it late, right? But I mean, we are recognizing them and we're trying to make things to amend them. There has been a lot of discussion on updating PNP language, like on the policies within Informs. We now have, as diversity, equity, and inclusion, I like what Julie said earlier, we shouldn't just say DEI because it kind of like removes the notion. Like as diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are present and we have some amazing participation in the colloquia. This used to be at the, I'm going to say at the whim, at the, basically whoever was organizing this could decide the topics that would be there, right? So right now, this is something that there is language in there that protects this, if you will. Or so all of these, they seem small, but from a policy perspective and for an organization as large as Informs, they steer us towards the right direction. And I think that this is obvious. We have a lot more members that are openly LGBTQIA plus with our having activities within Informs. This is something that wasn't as obvious or prominent even like 5 years ago. We have professors, students, practitioners from industry and government policy who are openly discussing about case studies that go against the status quo on healthcare. Primarily, healthcare has been like leader on this, but also on transportation. So 100%, there are activities to be taken, and that's the reason why earlier, I don't know whether you were here since you talked about the strategic plan of Informs. So earlier we talked about the need for this to be decentralized, each and every one of our communities in computing, in optimization, in health sciences, right, and so on. PSOR, public services, operations research, and so on. Each of them needs to be having these discussions and these steering the ship, if you will. So yeah, I don't know whether I answered the question or not. So I think that there are a lot of not as exciting activities that have happened behind the scenes, but I think that they are very important. I mean, I remember that at the DEI committee, at the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, Michael was there. We really celebrated the change in PNP language, for example, in the awards discussions, right, about the need for this not to be something that we all agree on, but the need for this to be written down and something that we follow as one more guideline when we're forming an awards committee or when we're deciding who the chairs would be for next year.
Yeah,
but thank you for that question. Yes, that's
yeah, thanks, Chris. And so Julie and Justin, I'd like to suggest a few things, even though I am not a panelist, so I'm going to put it out there. You can respond to it. But if I had to make a wish list for things that Informs could do to support the mission of DEI, I might suggest that they provide resources for all of us who teach to help us figure out how to infuse notions of DEI related issues like racial and social justice into the classes that we as engineers and business professors, as distinct from applied social scientists and humanities people, can do in the classroom. Perhaps Informs could provide guidance for, again, those of us who may see ourselves as mathematicians or algorithms people, to ask, well, how could we engage with notions of DEI in creative ways? Many professional societies are now asking whether they should have their annual conferences in states that have adopted restrictive laws. And the Planning Society has recently moved their conference from Florida, for example. So those are examples of things that we could be discussing. Justin and Julie, have I overstepped the bounds or anything you'd like to add?
I'm going to add one link to the chat because Informs Transactions on Education has a special issue coming up that specifically focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion in ORMS classrooms. So I just linked it in the chat. It's not out yet. They're still accepting papers, but that would be something to probably keep an eye on, because I think that would be great for the community and probably helpful for a lot of us as instructors.
Thank you so much. I would love for the conversation to keep going, but to respect the hour, I'm going to do something where I'll ask Justin and Julie and Adrienne if they might take 30 seconds or so to share some last thoughts about anything that we have talked about in this hour, or things that you might encourage the audience to take away with them at the end of this webinar. May I start with Adrienne?
Sorry, I don't think I have anything to add, but thank you for having me today. And if you all are experiencing these things in your classroom, on your campuses, I'd love to hear about them. So please feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Adrienne. Justin is there. Do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with all of us?
Perhaps the only thought is something that's been said throughout the meeting so far. I think that it seems a little silly to me that diversity, equity, inclusion is somehow seen as a negative in some way. So I think that's one takeaway, is that by all accounts, I think these are positive things that are going to improve systems and improve productivity and improve a lot of stuff. So I think that's my biggest takeaway is just we should be focusing on the positive here. And there's a lot of good that we can do, I think, so especially as OR people.
Thank you so much, Justin. And Julie.
Yes, and I would, second that. I think as operations research and management scientists, these are fundamental. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are fundamental to the way that we look at the world and think about the world and try to model the world, and then think about ways to optimize systems within that world. And so for our community, I think these are incredibly important. And I urge us to remember what the words diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, and not allow others to label them in ways that are inconsistent with what they mean, actually.